Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Alt Hot Seat. I am your host, Chris Myers, and today we've got a really exciting show for you. I've got my guest, Tim Wasik of Rivet Advisory. Rivet is a cannabis advisory company focusing on M&A, financial advisory, and general cannabis and now psychedelic guru in the space up in Canada. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here, Chris. Much appreciated.
Oh, well, it's our pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us. Uh, can you start off by giving us a little bit of background on you and your firm?
Yeah, absolutely. Really brief background. I was a capital markets guy, working at a number of trading floors in Toronto mainly. Most of my career, I started an investment management firm here in Toronto, and then when it came, Chris, to cannabis, we could see the trend coming, the legalization trend in Canada coming, and I've never really been user in the cannabis space, and I thought to myself, okay, is this going to be big? And I ended up doing a whole bunch of research, 7, 8 years ago. Took a trip out to California to see the cannabis industry, and I came back and I said, this is real. Like, this is a real industry. This legalization trend is happening. So probably for the last 5, 7 years, I've been involved in a private equity firm in cannabis. And recently, the firm I'm affiliated with right now, Rivet Advisory, we are doing cannabis M&A. We're doing advisory work on M&A, looking for targets for cannabis companies, assisting on financial decisions, structuring balance sheets, etc. So we are still primarily working with North American and some global, but primarily North American cannabis and some small psychedelic companies.
Excellent. Now, would you share a little bit of an overview or your perspective of the question on everyone's mind, which is federal legalization? I know, obviously we talked a little bit before the show. I'm in Denver, Colorado. We were, the I think at the forefront of legalization, and I know that there's a lot of question out there as to the value of federal legalization versus just state and local legalization, and what that means for some of the investment opportunities that are in the marketplace.
Yeah, that's a great question, and unfortunately, I'm probably not going to give you a great answer, Chris, that you're going to hear, but I will try to tackle the issue of federal legalization. I'm going to give you and I'm going to be very brief, and I'm just going to give you directly to the point, Chris. From an investment perspective, you don't need federal legalization to look at this sector. This sector, in and of itself, with state legalization, we've recently seen New York, we've seen Connecticut, we've seen states going legal, which Chris. We see retail sales picking up. Retail sales in March, April, May, coming out of COVID, have been extremely strong. This is a sector in general that you don't need federal legalization, in my opinion, to invest in it. This is a sector trading at 10 to 12 times forward EBITDA. But let's talk about what happens if we do get federal legalization. And I don't think, when we talk about federal legalization, let's divide it into two parts. I think what you're asking, Chris, is, are we going to be fully federally legal where cannabis can be, and that probably, given what's going on with the House and the Senate, the Democrats and Republicans, I frankly don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. It's not going to happen this year. But we are seeing incremental baby steps. So if you think about an act like the Safe Banking Act, which essentially would allow access to the federal banking system for cannabis companies, because as you know, a lot of cannabis companies operate is still a cash business and a retail business as well. So I look at it this way: the Safe Banking Act has been pushed. It could come, I expect it, second half of this year. I don't know. But if it does happen, though, this would allow access not only to the capital markets, it would allow access to banking services, it will allow access to lines of credit, it would allow access to debt instruments, it would allow access for other issuers to list on the big boards, the NASDAQ, the NYSE. And as soon as that happens, then we have the large institutional investors, the significant high net worth investors jumping on jumping in the category because they have no other reason to say no. At which point we get a super revaluation upwards, and this industry is going to rocket. So I think instead of full federal legalization, we are going to have baby steps. So we are going to have small, little incremental steps, and I think the market has to look at it that way. We a lot of the legislation, whether like the MORE Act and the SAFE Act to a certain degree, is now morphing between cannabis legalization and the social justices that the Republicans are trying to bring into the argument. And at some point, we're getting and don't get me wrong, we should be going for both social justices and cannabis reform. I get all of that, and I completely agree we should be, but it gets very muddied. But but it doesn't really matter. The baby steps and the trends are in place. We're standing here right now with the most number of federal cannabis bills within the Congress, et cetera, that have ever been in place. So, so I know everybody would like to have federal legalization tomorrow. Great. I don't think it's going to happen. But what's important from the industry's perspective is that A, we're making progress, very big progress. It does take a lot of time. We may get the MORE Act. We may get the new Schumer Act coming. We're not sure the name of it. That may come in the next month or so. We don't know. But the sector in and of itself is continuing to run and continuing to roll from a sales perspective and continuing to roll from a legalization of the state perspective, which in and of itself makes it, in my mind, completely investable. Completely investable. Sorry, you can invest in it. I didn't mean it the negative way. I think if we do get the Safe Banking Act or we get federal legalization, you're just putting a cherry on top of the ice cream here. It would just explode multiples at that point. But I do think it's very murky. I think it's going to be very time consuming. But I think my perspective is it's not going backwards. It's only going forwards.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, one of the things that I've seen, because we discussed beforehand, I've been involved in the space from an investment perspective and from an advisory, not in the same way, more just strategic,
Yeah.
operational side. But one of the things I've seen that's been fascinating to me is that a lot of the pioneers, right? A lot of the people that took their lumps, they were the first growers, the first retail shops, particularly here in Colorado. They're actually the ones that lobby against large scale mass federal legalization in a lot of cases because they want to protect their domain. They carved out a very profitable little niche for themselves, and they know that, hey, what is it? Pioneers take the arrows. They're the ones that said, hey,
Yeah.
we carved this out. Now, if you just blanket legalize, they're concerned that the Philip Morris, the large players can step in and just take over. And so that was a fascinating thing for me to notice or to identify. So a lot of them are supporting, from a lobbying point of view and otherwise, that incremental approach that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And with banking being the primary driver of it, the ability to access capital to really smooth out some of the rougher edges of, particularly dealing with some of the anti-money laundering barriers that are in place that just make life a hassle for them.
I 100% agree, and Chris, we don't want. I know the local Colorado dispensaries want to maintain their autonomy, et cetera, but state legalization. Let's be frank and call a spade a spade. This is a tax issue, okay? This is a tax grab, and I don't mean to be crass about this, but we have a number of states that have massive deficits given the COVID spending. The federal government, frankly, is no different. And so the reason we're seeing Connecticut, which could be estimates are up to $800 to $1 billion market by the time it's fully mature. We've got New York, which has just happened, as you guys know. We've got, probably 2022. Don't be surprised if you see Florida. which launches a rec program, and that could be probably the second or third largest market behind California. And and as you say, I don't want to be crass about this. I don't want to get myself in trouble, but this is, yes, there are social issues why it makes sense to legalize cannabis, but you can see the trend accelerating purely from a tax dollar perspective. These states are
Absolutely.
looking at California, they're looking at Colorado, saying, "Hey, we need our tax dollars too," and that's why it's not going to stop.
No. So on that note, what are the other major trends you see on the state level? Do you think it's primarily just uh, obviously tax revenue is tax revenue, and that's something that everybody needs. And yes, there is a deficit from COVID spending. Are there any other trends you see that are driving that, or do you think those are the primaries?
No, I think there's I do think we're going to use this term once again, Chris, baby steps. So we see a lot of the southern Republican dominant states as opposed to adopting full rec or adopting a medical program. So, as you know, most people adopt a medical program, then they move to a rec program once they're comfortable that medical works. So we continue to see the adoption, and the only trend I guess I'm seeing, frankly, is just the acceleration of adoption at the state level. And so I think what we're going to continue to see is not only Democrat-led states, but Republican-led states continue to adopt either medical or rec programs going forward in the later part of this year. Um, so no, I don't think there's any other major trends, to be honest, that I can think of other than legalization. I do think it's a tax issue, but also I do have to stress there are a number of social benefits, and if we can at least, even as you know, Chris, some states have decriminalized it, so it's no longer a criminal offense for possession. These all go to bode well for every state, and maybe the answer is that social justice and that social impact of cannabis, I would argue, has certainly been highlighted more in the last 6 months than it ever was in the past,
Yeah.
to be honest. So
Tim, let's shift gears for a second. We've been talking about the regulatory environment, the legal environment. Let's look at some of the business trends. One of the things that has been really interesting, I think, as of late, that's really stood out to me at least, is this trend towards consolidation. There's been this massive consolidation in the industry across all of the different verticals. What's your take on that?
it's absolutely going to continue. I mean, so I think there's let's just say let's look at two trends. So inter-industry trend, if I can just use Canada as an example, we had very buoyant capital markets for the last few years. Buoyant capital markets led to a lot of excess capital coming into the industry. That led to a lot of excess capacity. We've seen a ton of rationalization in Canada because we have way too much capacity, and
Yeah.
that was just a function of too much capital. It's simply, that's all it was. So we've seen massive consolidation as people rationalize projects in Canada. In the United States, if you look at what's gone on in Canada, the rule, you definitely saw a decreasing trend on prices and input costs. It is becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to manufacture cannabis. You can see it coming from offshore. If it does eventually come from offshore, grown at 6, 7 cents a gram in Colombia, etc. So if you want to scale in the United States, and this is really kind of a land grab right now, you're going to have to merge. So, we saw the Truly merger for a couple $1 billion, and we're going to continue to see some other mergers within the industry as people make this, as companies make the big land grab. So I think it's going to continue. We've seen a ton of it. And I also think there's been a number of smaller players, which is common in many industries, Chris, probably some in your state, that have said, look, I can't do this alone. You know what? I mean, I need to get scale. I need to get critical mass. I'm going to sell out. So that's taken place. But what's interesting, Chris, is trend number two is the consolidation from the big boys.
Hmm.
And I don't know, you mentioned Philip Morris, but Marlboro, Philip Morris said back in April they were looking at the cannabis market. We know that BAT, British American Tobacco, made an equity investment in a Canadian firm called OGI
Yeah.
earlier this year. And, we've talked about Imperial Brands having an investment in Oxley, and Altria have an investment in a company called Kronos, and, Constellation, obviously, with Canopy, the $5 billion investment, and Jazz taking out GW Pharma. So, as the legislation progresses and as cannabis becomes, quote, mainstream, and let's say the Safe Banking Act does resolve itself within the next year, don't be surprised if we see a lot more of these large CPGs come in with acquisitions. So I think a lot of these large CPGs have just taken a toehold for now. They're monitoring the situation, but they are primed to come in and take out some of these large players. And we've seen it. We've seen a huge appetite for it. And so if we do get some sort of movement on the legalization front, imagine what happens when they come in. And where are the multiples going then, Chris?
Yeah.
And I think it's going to happen in both ways. I think both cannabis companies within themselves for scale. And then I think, don't forget, this is going to be big globally. This is going to be big globally from CPG and from pharma, et cetera. And it's already started. Started.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think it's that move towards sophistication that's going to create more of an opportunity for investors. And that actually leads really well into the next question. Prior to that trend, and considering the fact that in the absence of the Safe Banking Act, which hasn't been passed yet, but even some of the innovations that have taken place that have enabled these companies to inch ever closer towards more traditional banking and more traditional operations, it was the Wild West in a lot of respects. I know here in Colorado, when it first went live in, I think, 2013, there, old-fashioned kind of holdups or stick-ups where people were carrying duffel bags full of cash, and they get robbed. And so when you have that sort of environment, and I should say, people are sort of making the rules up as they go, both from the regulatory side and the operational side. You create an environment in which sometimes less than reputable individuals can thrive, right? And there's both the intentionally less than reputable, and then there's just the hustlers.
Yeah.
So as an investor, what do you look for? How do you determine who is disreputable, who is a hustler, and where are the diamonds in the rough?
Great question. I guess our coming from Canada, our Vancouver Stock Exchange, as you know, is filled with companies that are full of hustlers and ex-mining bankers that are looking for their next pot of gold, as you know, Chris. And I think when we look at companies, and when I look at companies, the first thing you always do is look at management. And to be honest, I know this is going to sound very strange, but within a 10-minute conversation with management, you probably know this, Chris, you can get their modus operandi. You can figure out if they're in it to build a real company, or you can figure out if they're in it to flip. And if they truly are in it to build a real company, then you obviously look for the pedigree, you look for their past history and their ability to do it, etc. And then all the other minor stuff comes into place. Do they own shares in the company? I hate to see companies where founders' shares were issued at a penny and they're issuing to investors at $10, and they haven't put a penny in, and that just doesn't sit well. But I agree with you wholeheartedly in terms of the people in the industry. But I would say though that this industry is professionalizing. This industry is becoming. We're seeing a number of those old cowboys. We're seeing a number of those old CEOs leave the industry. We are seeing a number of entrepreneurs that started these firms that were right for the company at that time leave as the industry matures. And I can tell you, this, a lot of CPG executives are starting to join cannabis companies because they believe 2.0, 3.0 is going to be the next leg up. So we're seeing, Pepsi executives, Coke executives, I'm using these as an example, right? Kind of come into the industry to really professionalize it. So, looking forward, I get where you came from. I get it wasn't a shady industry, and it has a reputation of being a shady industry, a reputation of shady players. Don't deny that. Can't change that. Having said that, that as it becomes as it becomes larger, more professionalized, is quickly
Hmm.
changing, and I think we're seeing massive management changes. And a good example is a guy like Bruce Linton, who started Canopy, and Bruce Linton was a fantastic entrepreneur. He was a visionary in the cannabis space, and he took Canopy to become the world's largest cannabis company. And um, you know, but now as the company kind of develops into a more mature, there was a change in management, and there's an example of an example of that, and it's going to continue. So from an investor perspective, beware. Look at the people, find out where they're from, do your homework, buyer beware. But I would say though that's changing over time.
Well, that sort of answers my next question, which is, where do you think the industry is on the maturity curve? Obviously, you know, industries have that wild west innovation, and then they
Yeah.
start to mature. It seems to me that we're really at that point where it's still early days in many respects, but that the massive growth and the explosion in terms of the multiples is ahead of us. Would you agree?
100%. This is, and I'm going to say there's two things. We tend to fixate on the United States
Hmm.
and or Canada, United States, North America, and we shouldn't. So we've already talked, Chris, about what's going on in the U.S., and we all get that, and we won't hash that. But I think what the market and what investors have to realize is not only is this exploding in the United States, and if we get change in legislation, and we're already seeing monster growth rates in terms of earnings and EBITDA growth at a very cheap multiple. We're seeing significant generation of free cash flow. And we have the potential explosion in multiples if we get legalization or the Safe Banking Act. But my point though, Chris, what's interesting is I think people forget this is a global phenomenon
Yeah.
too. Like this just isn't North America. And albeit Europe will be, as soon as we get, I think Europe's 5, 7, 10 years behind North America, but they will be bigger than North America, bigger than the United States. Germany medical cannabis sales last month hit an all-time high. Albeit it's fairly small, but you're seeing significant traction from a global basis. So Europe is slowly adopting cannabis as the United States was, call it 5, 7, 10 years ago. We've seen an explosion in Africa. We've seen even the Far East countries adopt much more liberal stances on cannabis and hemp. So, and then we could talk about Australia and South America, et cetera. So, when you ask, Chris, is this early days? Absolutely. It's early days in the United States, but don't forget, this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. This is not. People are missing the whole global trend here. This is happening all over the world, which gives me comfort that the United States is kind of leading the next couple of years, let's say, and it's going to be a great boom. But we've got other countries and other geographic areas that are going to lead this boom for the next 5, 7, 10 years. So from an investment perspective, if you think about it that way, from an investment perspective, we got a long way to go.
Yeah.
We got a long way to go.
Is there a particular market segment, vertical, that you're really excited about? I mean, we tend to think of this all as retail, right? Um,
Yeah.
but obviously, there's a lot more to it than that. Is there a particular element that's really interesting to you right now?
Yeah, everybody likes to focus on brands and building of the next cannabis 2.0 and building the next gummy and the next chocolate bar and taking THC and infusing it in other products. I get that. So everybody wants to focus from an investment perspective in a sector in the market of what's big. Except it's very hard to invest in a brand, probably because you really don't know who's going to win. To be honest, you really don't. It's a very difficult proposition, Chris. But if there's a sector that I like, that's actually, and my partners and I like, and we discuss this all the time, and this is completely under the radar, and it's not like anybody really would think about it, but we think about it this way. As the industry professionalizes, and we talked about this, as the industry gets, let's say, the Safe Banking Act or access to the federal banking system is allowed in the next 6, 9, 12 months. As we've already talked about, we hire CPG executives as the industry, quote, professionalizes and becomes a truly legit industry. What's missing is what we call these midstream technology or midstream infrastructure plays
Mm.
that support the industry. So you know that all these cannabis companies have to upgrade their accounting, have to upgrade their tracking, product tracking, have to upgrade the way products get distributed from one end to the other. So there's extensive scrutiny on, for instance, product that gets thrown out. You have to account for that. You can't let, wasted product. You have to account for everything. So one of our theses is, and if you think about what we've talked about so far, Chris, and where the industry is going, one of our theses is there's some very interesting plays in what we call midstream technology, where as this industry professionalizes, we don't want to be in the growers because we think it's a race to the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
The retail products or the retailers themselves, yeah, they're differentiating, but it's fairly hard to figure out which one's going to win over the long term. But we know that every single company is going to need systems to support that infrastructure. So we've kind of looked at it from an investment thesis and are really looking at it as there's going to be some very interesting opportunities in what we call, as I say, midstream technology plays, if that makes sense for you.
Yeah, no,
Because to fuel growth, if you want to professionalize and you want to be a global player, guess where you're going to have to spend money? Right there. Period.
that makes a lot of sense. So, if you're advising somebody who's brand new to the industry, right? They don't know necessarily how to get invested in the space.
Yeah.
How would you suggest they get involved, right? What are the best vehicles for high net worth individuals or beginners that are looking to allocate a portion of their portfolio into the cannabis space?
Yeah, very simply. I mean, if you want to play this state legalization trend, which we've addressed, the federal legalization trend, which we've addressed, the best way to play it, in my mind, is just a basket approach. And you can buy a US ETF called the MSOS, which is a multi-state operator ETF. And it gives you kind of a broad exposure to both large and mid-cap multi-state operators. Basically, to be honest, it just gives you exposure to a variety of cannabis stocks that operate in the United States. So what you're really doing with that by buying just that simple ETF is you're basically getting exposure to those long-term trends that we just talked about for the last few minutes. It's the simplest way to do that if you're not into picking individual stocks, if you don't want to pick individual stocks. So look at just an ETF. I know there's several of them out there. I just use the MSOS as just an example. That will give you exposure to the entire sector. If you do believe in the trends that we've outlined today, that stock should benefit. And from a financial perspective, I can tell you, I think the stocks right now, and we could talk about this, Chris, are absolutely dirt cheap in my mind, given the growth you're getting. But that would be an easy way to play it. I would avoid, unless you're very sophisticated, and I know a lot of friends and family will come up to investors and say, hey, put in some money into my private company. I'm starting a cannabis company. I'm doing this. No problem. I have no problem if individual investors want to do that, but just beware. Do your homework. Do your homework. If you but you there's a much better chance you're going to lose your money than make it. But having said that, I'm not discouraging it. Just do your homework. That's all.
Well, let's talk about that point you made just a moment ago. Valuations are arguably very low given the growth that's happening in the space. Yeah, how would you suggest advisors think about that?
Uh, I'm actually. Let me just give you some. I'll give you some stats. This is kind of where the industry is trading at right now, and this is where I expect some of these stocks to go. So if I look at some of these large US MSOs, we have operating margins. We have EBITDA margins in and around the 35, 39%, which from a margin perspective is absolutely unheard of. So we have huge margins in some of these stocks. If I look at Cresco, Curaleaf, Green Thumb, and Trulieve, which arguably some of the four largest MSOs, in 2022, next year they're expected to grow top line at 41%. And they're expected to grow EBITDA at 58% in 2022. So I look at those growth numbers and let's pretend I'm wrong. Let's cut them in half. Let's cut them in half. And EBITDA grows at 20% or 25%. Let's say something else. These stocks are trading at 10 to 12 times forward EBITDA, which is exactly where the S&P is trading right now. So let me get this straight. I've got 50%, 40% EBITDA growth. I've got 35, 39% EBITDA margins, and I'm trading at 10 to 12 times forward numbers. So what am I missing here? So what I can't, I struggle to explain this. I think what's happened is I think because there are a lack of investors in the space because large institutions aren't in it because of the Banking Act. High net worth may avoid it because of federal regulation. That's great. But I look at it from a fundamental basis and I say these things are an absolute gift as far as I'm concerned, from a valuation perspective, given what we're getting in the industry. So the way I would kind of approach it from an investment perspective is, as long as you buy the thesis of what we've just talked about over the next 5 years, I don't know why you wouldn't look at the sector.
Yeah.
I don't know why you wouldn't. If you don't believe in the thesis, no problem. That's great. But and if you're not buying these stocks because you're waiting for a change in the federal legislation, my argument is it doesn't really matter.
Right.
We're getting massive state level changes and we're getting massive retail sales, and therefore without federal legislative changes, we're generating massive EBITDA growth without changes. So, from my perspective, I think people should look at the space. Why they're not in it is probably just a whole bunch of different factors. It doesn't, maybe the short-term attention span of the market is looking at, the meme stocks and stuff, and that's fine. They can do that. I think it's only going to be a matter of time before people see the fundamentals of the space.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. Well, my final question, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because we've talked about a lot of these big macro trends, right? And
yeah,
everything from legalization to the global market. But if you flash forward 10 years from today, what's the one single thing that you think will be the most surprising development in the industry from now to 10 years from now? What's the one thing that'll surprise you the most?
That's a great question. I think what will surprise people is how effective the development of cannabis-based products will be, and more pharma products. I'm going to go down the pharma route. More effective with less side effects than what we currently have in the market. I think cannabis has been, as you know, been vilified for the last 50 years. Say no to drugs. There has been no research or very limited research on the product. And I think what we're going to realize in 10 years is that A, that probably shouldn't have happened, but B, this is a plant that effectively could replace some existing medicines and existing products that we have with far less side effects, i.e. a more natural occurring way to solve issues such as pain, sleep, etc. And I think when people think about cannabis, they think cannabis in isolation. I think about cannabis versus what else we have in place right now, such as sleep. Well, let me just give you an example, Chris. If you want to take a sleeping pill, there are side effects for sleeping pills. You may wake up groggy, etc., and your doctor recommends not taking too many of them, etc. But what if the cannabis plant in the next 10 years can displace that existing product that we've got, give you a same effectiveness or same efficacy with much lower side effects and no side effects, frankly, because it's an all natural medication versus a synthetic one. So I think, what you're going to be surprised with, to answer your question, over the next 10 years is, I think you're going to see the effectiveness of cannabis displace some industry-leading products, especially from the pharma side that you've said, that people have said, oh, they'll be here forever. And I think what we're going to realize is there are better and more effective alternatives out there, and they may be in the form of the cannabis plant.
Mm-hmm. Tim, thank you so much. If people want to get in touch with you and Rivet Advisory, what's the best way to do that?
Just email me, twasik, TWASIK, at rivetadvisory.ca, and I'd be happy to chat with anybody.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was fascinating from my side. I'm sure our viewers find it fascinating as well. And we look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
I appreciate it, Chris. Thanks very much.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.